Great to see you this morning. Just kind of get us all on the same page where we're going to be going the next several weeks. We're going to be doing some standalone messages over the next several weeks on different topics, different texts. And the other week when Scott asked me if I would preach today, I kind of had free reign, so to speak, on the topic that I wanted to discuss. And as I was thinking about the culture here at Catalyst, about a topic that's important for us as a relationally driven church, a relational discipleship church, the one topic that came to my mind was the topic of loneliness. It's fun to think about, right? It's a fun topic to think about. It's a fun topic to look at, but I think it's an important topic to look at this morning as it pertains to guarding ourselves against loneliness. Several years ago, not several years ago, it's been about 2 years ago now, and I just went kind of through this stage in ministry where there were some things happening around me that really bothered me, and because of that, I felt like I had to overcompensate and kind of seem like I had it together when other things were not. And that led me into kind of like, I don't want to call it a mental breakdown, but it made me go into a place that I was not very comfortable with. I feel like I'm a jolly guy, but during this moment in my life, I wasn't really happy. I wasn't really jolly. I felt lonely. And come to find out that with everything going on around me, I kind of isolated myself a little bit. I had isolated myself from the people that were important to me, that I really needed to be around to lift me up and to encourage me. And of course, I was around my parents, my family all the time, but it was other people in my life that I didn't realize I needed those relationships until I began to drift towards isolation. Here's the thing. If we are honest with ourselves, some of the hardest moments in our lives are those moments in which we feel isolated. I hate to beat a dead horse for us this morning, but I think that one of the things that COVID showed us through that whole situation is just how important relationships are for us, just how important human interaction can be. And this morning, perhaps you are here, you have people sitting to your left, you see people sitting to your right, you probably said hi to somebody. I know you did because we have an awesome welcome team here at Catalyst, but you said hi to somebody as you came in, and given all of that, you're still sitting here, and maybe you feel a little bit lonely. God's desire for you and I was that we would never feel alone, that we would never stand alone. I mean, you look into the book of Genesis, right? The very, very beginning of things. God, He creates Adam, and He saw that everything was good, but one of the things that was not good was that man was alone. And God says, well, go try to find an appropriate companion. And He can't find anything in the wild, so what does God do? He puts Adam to sleep. He takes a rib and he creates Eve. And then there was this sense of completeness because man was no longer alone, even though God was right there with Adam. It's also why God created His church and established His church so that we, as a group of individuals, wouldn't have to be going through the tough moments of life alone. See, that's what He wants for you, that you would never stand alone. He created us with this longing, with this desire to be connected with others. And here's going to be our main point that we're going to wrestle with this morning together. And I want you to keep this at the forefront of your mind. It's this idea that we are created for connection, but sometimes we drift towards isolation. God created us to be connected with one another. Yet there are those moments in our lives in which we drift towards isolation. Sometimes that drift is on purpose, but sometimes that drift is done completely on accident, unintentionally. God never intended for us to live our lives alone. He wouldn't have created Eve. He wouldn't have established his church. I want you to listen to what the Apostle Paul shares to the church of Ephesus. This church is composed mostly of Gentiles, new Christians, people who were really outsiders, people who had been religiously isolated. And here's what he says to them in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19 through 22. He says, "Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling which God lives by his Spirit." So, of course, the Apostle Paul, he's not talking about this literal brick and mortar building. He's talking about people. He's talking about you. He's talking about me. God, he's building his church out of stones, you and me, putting us together stone by stone. And I want to say that if you are here this morning and you're visiting, or this is like your first time here with us, I want you to know very intentionally that you are welcomed here. We are so glad that you are here. We are a relationally based church. Relational discipleship, I mentioned that at the very beginning. Being in a relationship with others, that's the key ingredient to discipleship. It's the key ingredient in growing in your spiritual journey. If you were to go and to look at what we call the discipleship wheel, it's right out here above the water fountains in between the bathrooms. If you look at that and you go around it, you will notice pretty clearly that none of that can be done outside of relationships. That is why it's a key ingredient here at Catalyst. You can't be discipled, you can't grow in your faith journey by being alone and isolating yourself. Because we were created with this need to lean on one another. God uses his people to strengthen, to encourage one another. Because we were created for connection, but sometimes, rather intentionally or unintentionally, we drift towards isolation. Social media. Let's talk about that for just a little bit. Social media can be a really, really great tool. Here at Catalyst, we utilize it. You follow Catalyst Church on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on YouTube. In fact, while I'm talking, if you want to go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel or whatever, you can go right ahead. I encourage that. But at the same time, there's also this reality that social media can be a distraction. It can make relationships feel very artificial. I was on Facebook the other day. If you're not friends with me, why not become friends with me? Just look how Richie go. But I was looking, and there was this girl that I had went to high school with, and she changed her last name. And I came across it, and I didn't recognize who it was. And it was really bothering me that I didn't know who one of my friends on Facebook was. So I clicked on her profile and started not stalking her, but curious about who in the world is this person. And I went back to the photos from 2010. I was not stalking her. 2010, when we were in high school, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I remember her. But I hadn't talked to her in years, didn't even realize that she got married. Then that caused me to look at the rest of my friends list. I don't really know most of my friends, who they are or what stage of life they are at. I just said, I accept their friend request, right? Sometimes the relationships that we have on social media can be artificial. We long for connection. Y'all remember MySpace? What was your MySpace song? I'm just kidding. You don't have to tell me that. But I remember when I was in high school, we didn't have internet at the house, so I'd constantly be asking my mom, can I go to your office and look at my MySpace page to see if I got any new likes on my latest photo? And that's kind of how you determine your worth. It's kind of how value was determined by how many likes you got. We went on vacation a couple of weeks ago, and we were playing putt-putt golf. I'm not going to tell you who won, but we were playing putt-putt golf. And while we were playing, my mom's standing there. She's taking some really cool action shots of us with our putters, hitting the ball, trying to get it into the hole. But what she didn't post, or she didn't take pictures of, were the arguments that my dad and I got into on the rules and how many times we had actually hit the ball. My dad kind of, I'm going to call him out, he kind of has this thing where he'll hit the ball and it'll roll back down and hit the putter again, but it'll still hit it and count it as one hit. So, but those are, you don't post those types of pictures because you want people to see the good side of things. You want people to see, you want people to feel envious of what you have and what you're doing. Not all of us, but sometimes we do. And sometimes, unintentionally, that can drive us towards isolation. We were created for connection, but sometimes we drift towards isolation. And there are a ton of hills that are not worth dying on in our lives. There are a ton of hills, or a ton of battles that are not worth fighting. But, this is the exception. We need to fight the drift. Need to fight the drift towards isolation. It's a spiritual battle. It's a fight, but it's a fight worth fighting. So the question is, how do we fight the drift towards isolation? How do we guard ourselves against loneliness? Well, that first starts by knowing that we were not created to stand alone. And this morning, if you are a note taker, whether you got paper, pencil, or pen, or you do it on your phone, this is going to be an easy sermon to take some notes with, because we are going to look at three key thoughts on fighting against the drift towards isolation. And before we look at these thoughts, I want to note that the most important connection that you can have is with God. When you surrender your life to Him, you make Him the Lord of your life, you enter into a relationship in which you will never be alone. You may face you will face trials and hardships in your life. They don't necessarily stop, but God is always going to be there on your side. And years later, you can look back and see just how faithful God has been to you. So when it comes to fighting the drift towards isolation, we need to remember the faithfulness of God. Most important connection that we are called to have is with God. When you walk with God, He walks with you. Even when you are not faithful, God is incredibly faithful. When you feel like you're drifting towards isolation, what you need to do is stop, breathe, collect yourself, and remember just how good, just how faithful God is. Someone once told me that it's so much better to be with God in the valleys of life, the dark times, than it is to be without God on those mountaintops. Scripture tells us in the Old Testament book of Joshua about God's people, the Israelites, how they had escaped Egypt and they were heading towards this land that had been promised to them. It's described as a land flowing with milk and honey. But because of their stubbornness, because of repeated disobedience, they find themselves isolated as a nation. They find themselves wandering through the desert for 40 years, drifting. But finally, there's this scene in which they are standing on the banks of the Jordan River, and the promised land is right across from them. All they have to do is cross the river. This is a huge day. This is a huge deal for the Israelites. And it's so important that God tells Joshua to take 12 stones from the river and to stack them as a memorial to remember God's faithfulness. And here's where we pick up the story in Joshua chapter 4, verse 21. We read that he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you, Can we put that back up, please? For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. So, when we feel alone, when we find ourselves drifting towards isolation, we must collect ourselves and remember what God has done, what he's currently doing, and what he's going to do in the future. When you feel like you're wondering, when you are growing weary in the waiting, when you feel alone, remember God is faithful. Because the same God who was with the Israelites in the wilderness, as they were wandering, is the same God who is with you and I today. When you need provision, God's going to come through. When you feel trapped, God's going to give a way out. When you feel or realize that you are dead in your sin, God, he sent his son, Jesus. A buddy of mine shared with me kind of an interesting experience that he had during a worship service one Sunday. He was preaching on the redemption of God. Seems like a pretty good thing to talk about in church, right? So he gives this sermon, and he gives this impassioned call at the end for people to give their lives to the Lord and to be baptized. And after the service was over, this was a larger congregation, but there was one lady who came up to him, and she said, I feel like God's putting it on my heart to be baptized. And he said, well, that's great, that's fantastic. Let's go ahead and get you into the changing room and get you ready. And she goes, I think we need to hold off a week. And he said, what? What in the world do you mean? We need to hold off a week. We can do it today. And that's when she knelt over, lifted up her pants leg, and on her ankle was one of those tracking devices. I'm going to put this down. There'll be a glare on the video. But she said, I can't get this tracking device wet, and I don't have anything to cover it up, so we'll probably have to wait till next week. And he looked at her and said, you stay here. We're going to figure this out. So we got a couple of the men from the church to run around the church building, and I don't know what it is, but you're always going to be able to find like grocery bags when you need them. They're always in the weirdest spots. But he told them, go find grocery bags and duct tape, and we're going to figure this out. So the song ends, the worship leader kind of noodled a little bit with the guitar so that they could get things situated. And they came and they put the bags on her ankle and rolled her up with a bunch of duct tape around it so it wouldn't get wet. And they didn't even mention anything when she was baptized about it. The pastor took her under, brought her back up, but her leg stayed up like she was doing gymnastics. And the pastor my buddy gave her the opportunity to kind of share her testimony a little bit, and she shared how she had been involved in some pretty rough things in her past and was still going through some legal troubles because of this tracking device. That's why she had it on her ankle. But she let everybody know that day that the ankle bracelet, what many see, make the assumptions of it, think about her past, she now sees it as this great example of the faithfulness of God. See, God is faithful. God will never leave you or forsake you. He can use your past to open doors for what he desires for you to be. See, it doesn't matter where we have been. It matters where we are going in the faith that we are headed there with. However, there are moments in our life in which it can be difficult to remember God's faithfulness. So when that happens, in order to fight the drift towards isolation, this is number 2 here, we have to realize that God places people in our lives to lean on. Everybody needs somebody to vent to share doubts, to share fears with. Just because I'm a pastor doesn't mean that I never doubt or fear or have fears. And Scott shares this a lot too. We both doubt, we both have fears. Here's the thing, your doubts don't disqualify you from anything. They just confirm that you are human. They affirm that you are human. They affirm our humanity. And because of that, we desperately need the right people in our lives. Because the difference between where you are and where God wants you to be depends greatly on having the right people around you in your corner. Those who are going to make you better, those who are going to constantly remind you of God's faithfulness. A few years ago, I had a young man come up to me one Sunday after church, and he was a visitor, and I could tell that he wasn't doing great. He had something on his mind, and we went into one of the side rooms, and I talked with him, and he basically shared with me, without going into a lot of detail, some of the things that he was involved in that were not beneficial. They were not productive. And the one word that he kept, or the one thing that he kept saying throughout that conversation is, I need a quick fix. I need something to happen quick so that I can go back and be a good influence on these people. And after he finished talking, I prayed with him, and I said, man, why do you feel like you need a quick fix? I've noticed that's something that you said in our conversations. And he goes, well, I want a quick fix. I want to fix my life immediately so I can go back and be a good example for the guys that I hang around. And I'm like, well, I mean, that's nice, but how soon do you plan on hanging around with those guys that have been a bad influence on you? And he's like, well, as soon as possible. I said, well, okay, here's the thing. There's not necessarily anything as a quick fix. I'm not doubting what God can do. He can work instantaneously in someone's life. But man, it seems like you don't need to be around those people because they are not building you up. They're not strengthening you, and maybe you need to step away from some of those relationships because those don't seem like the right people. After our conversation, he eventually said, yeah, that's what's holding me back, is those individuals. He didn't need to cut off the relationship completely, but he needed to understand that if he was going to change, he maybe needed to distance himself a little bit and find the right people to be around. You know, sometimes there are relationships that maybe we just need to step away from for a season because they're not helping us grow. They're not helping us get to where we need to be. Maybe those relationships tempt you, and what happens is that gives Satan a foothold to weasel into the nooks and crannies of your life. We need to find the right people to be around. But how is that done? How do we find the right people? Well, here's a few ways. First, you can start serving. One of my closest friends I still have to this day from Bible college, his name is Stephen, and we oftentimes check on one another, see how each other is doing. But I met him through a service day that we did in Bible college. My freshman year, we could sign up to serve in different areas of Knoxville where I went to school. It just so happened me and him signed up for the same location. And while we were cutting and trimming bushes, doing some painting and moving weeds, him and I, we were forced to talk with one another. And I quickly came to find out that this is the right person. This is one of these people that I need in my corner. But the second thing is, kind of overlaps with that, get involved. Get involved. And if you are here this morning and you don't have a church home, we truly believe in our Give Us Five. Andy talked about that at the beginning of the service. And we don't just believe in it because It will help you out to see if Catalyst is the right fit, though that's definitely like the huge reason for it. But it's also going to expose you to different ways that you can get involved in the life of the church. Here in, I think, August, we are going to be having a church work day in which we tidy up some things around the church building here. I think that we're going to be doing some things at the offices that are right behind this parking lot in the back. Great way to get involved. Another way is connection groups. We're going to be kicking off our connection groups here in September. Go ahead and put that on your radar. We're going to have a day in which you can meet the connection group leaders. It's going to be really good. Our connection groups are these groups of individuals around the Greensboro area where we meet during the week and we talk about the message. Sometimes all the time for my group, there's some really good snacks. But there are some really good snacks, great conversation. It just gives us an opportunity to connect, to lean on one another. And those are great places where you can find your people, that you can find the right people. But here's the third thing that you can do to find the right people. Be transparent. Open up. Be honest. Scott said this multiple times, but there are not many churches that would be okay with how transparent their church leaders are. But we have a great culture here at Catalyst in which we're able to do that. What I found out is that we may impress others by talking about our accomplishments, but we connect by being transparent and sharing our weaknesses. We fight the drift when we remember the faithfulness of God. Fight the drift when we lean on one another. And then finally, we fight the drift when we released the power of our story. Here's the thing, everybody needs God. Everybody needs somebody. And there's somebody who needs you. Every single person in this room this morning has a story. There is power in testimony. There is power in story. There may be someone in your life, you got them on your mind right now, and God's placing them on your mind for a reason. Maybe you need to reach out, encourage them. Maybe you need to share part of your story that's going to benefit them and help them through a very difficult moment in their life. You know, Scripture is chock full of stories about God's faithfulness. I want to invite the band to come up here as we prepare to wind down the discussion. But when I think about stories in Scripture about God's faithfulness, I think about this guy named David. You've heard of David. And his battle with this other guy, this giant. What's his name? This Goliath. And Goliath reminds me a lot of myself. Strong, mighty, I guess he was handsome. But we know the story. Goliath, this mighty warrior, he challenges God, he challenges the nation of Israel. And then we see David, this young shepherd boy. And he shows up and says, I'll fight this mighty giant Goliath. King Saul had an ego issue. He tries to put his armor on David, use his weapon. It doesn't work. So what does David do? Well, he goes and he grabs 5 smooth stones. And what does he do? He puts one in his sling. Shoo, shoo, shoo. Boom. Hits Goliath right in the head. And something they don't share in children's church back there is that David went, took the sword and cut Goliath's head off. Victory! But here's the thing. Goliath was not simply an enemy of David. He was an enemy of God and of God's people. God brought these people through this moment in time. And the same way that he was faithful to them is the same way he's going to be faithful with you when you face giants in your life as well. And from that, you're going to have an incredible story, an incredible testimony of God's faithfulness. I want you to think about what has to happen for a stone to become smooth. because they're not necessarily smooth to begin with. They must bump against other stones. They must crash down waterfalls, roll and wander through streams of rushing water, kind of like sandpaper, so to speak. But here's the thing, we are living stones. Every painful experience that we have in our lives can smoothen the rough edges that we may have. I don't know what all of us are going through this morning, but for some, maybe it is that. Maybe your waterfall moments going through the rough waters was that divorce that almost broke you, but now you're on the other side of it. Maybe those rocky moments was that business venture that you were 100% sure was going to work. Then you get in the middle of it and things don't quite pan out as you thought they would. Maybe it's that addiction that almost took you, and it's not just addiction to substances, but it could be addictions to pornography, to relationships that may not be the best, to bad habits. Maybe it's that loss of a close relative or friend, the betrayal that you experienced in a relationship. Because here is the thing, what the enemy means for evil, to hurt you, when you remember God's faithfulness, He's going to work it out for His good. Because whether you realize it or not, your story could be the one stone that somebody needs to take down the giant that they have in their life. See, God's building His church stone by stone. You, me, us together. So we need to fight that drift towards isolation. We are called to live in relationship with one another. That's why we never stand alone. Because I don't know about you, but I want to win. I want to win that battle against isolation. But in order to do that, I have to have the right people around me. Because the most important connection you can have is with God. And perhaps you're here this morning and you've been walking alone. Maybe you've been walking without God, without His people, the church. My encouragement for you is to remember that God never intended for you to be alone. And guess what? That's why He sent His Son, Jesus, to redeem us.